Welcome to the studio of the Daughters of St. Paul in Boston. I'm Father Benedict, and I'm going to share with you and some members of the community today 4 half-hour lectures on the questions of celibacy, chastity, and religious life. I've prepared these 4 sessions, they're almost classes really, to discuss with religious seminarians, priests, and devout lay people who lead consecrated lives some different aspects of religious chastity, the problems related to chaste celibacy, and some of the psychological things and insights that might be helpful to us as we try to integrate this discipline of the church and of religious life into our own spiritual lives. Now, I like to talk to people, so I'm not giving this from a very tightly prepared script, and I want you to know that it'll be very informal, and if you can relax and listen to me, we'll almost try to have a dialogue with each other. About a year ago, in 1985, I published this book with Paulist Press, The Courage to be Chaste, and it got a very fine popular reception. Some people were surprised about that because it defends the traditional teaching on single chastity taught by the Catholic Church over the ages. However, it also tries to incorporate, this book does, some of the newer notions of psychology, psychotherapy, sociology, into a discussion of religious chastity. Many years ago, almost by accident, as St. Paul would say, like one born out of time, I became a psychologist. You have to admit, I'm the best disguised psychologist in the city of New York. Nobody ever guesses that I was trained in Freudian analysis. I never guess it. And as you know, Freudians are supposed to be terribly interested in sex and sexuality. In fact, when I was finishing my course, one of my professors said, "Well, I suppose you'll do what all these other people here do, you'll write a book on sex." And I said, "No, don't know much about it, but maybe I'll write a book someday on chastity, which I know a lot about." Now, the purpose of my book and of these lectures is to try to speak very candidly with people about chastity. And I'm aiming them at people who accept the teachings of the Catholic Church on chastity and celibacy in the single life and the consecrated life. If you don't accept the teachings of the Catholic Church, my suggestion is that these tapes are probably going to annoy you. Maybe you should look at something else. If you do accept the teachings of the Catholic Church, these tapes may surprise you here and there because I'm going to try to use some insights drawn from psychology and some answers that I have come to believe integrate some of the insights of psychology and the insights of the teaching of the Church over the centuries. My principal guide will be the man who may be the greatest psychologist who ever lived, who is recognized by many as one of the great geniuses of all mankind, a man who knew a great deal about chastity and sexuality, and that is St. Augustine, who is called the holy psychologist. So if you don't like St. Augustine, get another tape. Take my advice. Now, I'm going to be terribly frank as best as I can. In talking about chastity, I will absolutely begin from the point of view that chastity is a form of human sexual behavior. It is not a form of angelic behavior. Years ago, in religious life and in the seminary, for some odd reason, angels were given as the models of chastity. The choice could not have been worse. Angels aren't chaste or unchaste. They're incorporeal. They don't have a body. They don't struggle with chastity at all. No, the best models for chastity would be very alive human beings, people who lived in the midst of the world, married people, single people, consecrated religious, consecrated priests, who in the fullness of their being, with all of the challenges that chastity offers, lived chaste lives by the help of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Now, what we're going to discuss is chastity, sexuality, and spirituality in this first introductory lecture. And then we're going to get immediately in our second one into problems. If you're a person who is not too familiar with religious life and you happen to be watching these tapes, let me tell you that religious and priests and dedicated lay people are human. There are hundreds of thousands of priests and religious in the world. Do some of them have problems with chastity? Of course they do. Of course they do. You can't get 100,000 anything doing something and not have some problems. Many people will be interested in insights into the origin of sexual difficulties. Also, we will talk about a very thorny and important problem at the present time, the problem of sexual identity. A person being at home and unconflicted in the sex into which they were born. And I'm going to try to do that discussion with great tact and delicacy, because in the course of my years as a priest, the Lord has called me to work frequently with good Christians who were struggling with some problems related to homosexuality. And I'm going to discuss even some other problems which show up very rarely, but which deserve a little attention. And finally, I have the answers. I got news for you. If I really had the answers to all these problems, we'd make a tape, and the Daughters of St. Paul and I could retire forever on the income if we had the answer to this one. But we're going to attempt some suggestions on conflict resolution, a well-balanced, organized life, the terrible importance of friendship, and finally, the position or the relationship of chastity to love of God and to love of neighbor. Now let's me free associate a little bit about sexuality. Oh, when I grew up, it was a word you hardly mentioned. I grew up in a great city of tough people, Jersey City. And we hardly ever mentioned the word sexuality. We were all one heart and one soul, people of the covenant. 75% of us were Catholic, 23% of us were Jewish. Everybody went to church or synagogue, and people, if they misbehaved, they kept it a very big secret. The 2% who were Protestants were all old, well-behaved, and well-dressed, and we didn't even think they had a problem with this. So it was a very chaste place. And words like sexuality didn't come into our vocabulary. And in fact, when this word started to get popular, after the so-called sexual revolution, I looked it up in the Oxford Dictionary, and I found out that the word means difference. Isn't it amazing? What a letdown that such an anxiety-provoking word as sex means difference. That's all it means. The English word segregation actually comes from the same root as the word sexuality, and it means to divide up. When you say sex, you mean difference. That's what you mean. Biological difference. Now, I never myself thought of the observance of chastity as a form of sexual behavior. Like many of the people watching this film, the Lord called me not from my mother's womb, but shortly thereafter. When I was 7.5 years old, I knew I would be a priest. When I was 8 years old, I found out that priests didn't marry. was perfectly all right with me. When I was 12 years old, I knew I would be a religious, and when I was 17, I grew this beard because it was required by the Capuchins in those days for novices. So I had it all wrapped up. No problems at all. Sexuality, it had nothing to do with me. It's foolish. It was a dumb idea. But somehow or other, it was the way that we dealt with things. People who didn't grow up in such an environment, or people who grew up in such an environment many years later, find it difficult that we could have been so naive about sexuality. But we were. And you may say, if you've grown up in these ugly days of the sexual revolution, when sexuality and the exploitation of the distortion of sexuality is on every television screen, except the Daughters of St. Paul, on every billboard and every magazine, when even religious figures write stories that are offensive, when all this is going on, it's hard to believe that there once was a group of people who knew nothing about it except the biological facts of how babies were conceived. You may find it very hard to believe, and you may think, oh, it was a lovely time. It was a dangerous time. It was a very dangerous time. Most of the Catholic immigrants into America, in fact, most immigrants, had grown up on farms. People who grow up on farms do not need any sex education, especially if they grew up in peasant villages, as the ancestors of almost all of us did. When people from the farms moved into the great urban industrial areas, the ordinary natural forms of education about sexuality were largely lost. On top of that, Queen Victoria of England had left in America a tradition of the denial of sexuality. Not only Her Majesty, but also all of the people who kind of imitated Queen Victoria, who managed to have many children despite all of this, all pretended that sexuality didn't exist. It wasn't mentioned. Certainly in polite company, certainly in mixed company. These things simply weren't mentioned. And consequently, when the so-called sexual revolution came, it hit the religious communities of America, not simply the monastic communities, but the different churches, the synagogue. It hit everybody like an avalanche. And people were unprepared. Now, the first thing that people did, including many religious people, was look for an answer, and they looked for the answer in psychology. Now, here's where the plot thickened. Because psychology is a zoo. You know what a zoo is? It's a collection of a lot of things that aren't related to each other. You go to the zoo, they got armadillos, rhinoceroses, giraffes, fleas, elephants. They have all sorts of things. And they're not really related to each other. Back in primeval times, they were, but how do you put a giraffe and a flea together? That's what psychology is. Psychology is not a coherent body of thoughts, not a coherent set of teachings. There are people in psychology who teach things that are absolutely mutually exclusive, totally distinct. When all the psychologists send their representatives and get together, some of them can't even see each other. They're so far apart. But somehow or other, religious people, including Catholic religious, kind of naively expected that psychology was going to answer their problems. I'll let you in on some secrets. I studied psychology and worked in the area of psychology for the last 25 years. I've been around a long time. Somebody said since Sigmund Freud was giving out sleeping pills. A long time. And psychology has no more the answers than anything else. It has some good questions. It has some good insights. It has people that behave very well and people that behave terribly. And so does organized religion. Can you think of what a zoo religion is? If you had one representative of every religious denomination in the world, what would it look like? A zoo. So no more than religion is coherent is psychology coherent. But religious people naively assumed that psychology was coherent and that it believed in the same things that religion believed in, at least in the general overall morality of things. And that is not true. I know psychologists who have the morals of chimpanzees. I know a few religious people who have the morals of chimpanzees too. So let's stop the humbug. There's an awful lot of humbug about sexuality, and be perfectly honest about it. Now, talk a little bit about chastity and psychology. Way back in the early 40s, one of the outstanding psychologists in the world, Erik Erikson, in a very important book called Childhood and Society, spoke about an application of the theories of Sigmund Freud on human development that could fit into the purview, the parameters of a religious person. He didn't aim the book at religious people, but religious people could feel at home with it. And in the middle of that book, Dr. Erikson gratuitously, absolutely gratuitously, made reference to the fact that most people are productive and generative and mature human beings when they are able to be good parents, when they're able to bring forth another generation of children and take care of that generation and leave that generation a group of responsible, well-balanced adults. Sounds like he left celibates out of it, doesn't it? Oh no. Right in the middle of the text, Dr. Erikson also said that when inspired by religious tradition, people chose to lead a life of vows, a monastic life. These people could be generative in a way that not only took care of the children of this life, but also prepared for the things of the next world. Some people were so astonished that Erikson said that they ignored it. But this great man took into account the importance of the celibate religious tradition among human beings. This celibate religious tradition is older than Christianity. It goes back into the Old Testament, to the bands of prophets. It's wider than Christianity and Judaism. In the Orient, there has been religious celibacy for 3,000 years. Gautama Buddha, the Hindu holy people, they all taught a tradition of religious celibacy. Even in modern times, Mahatma Gandhi, great spiritual founder of India, praised religious celibacy and encouraged people to lead a chaste celibate life by a clear decision, by vow. Somehow or other, this tradition was not well defended in the face of some applications of naive psychology. I'm in a particularly good position to discuss this because I was trained in an institute which was organized according to the therapeutic model of Sigmund Freud. And I could tell you that I knew a number of psychologists with this training, which seems so inimical to chastity, who could easily fit a defense and understanding of religious chastity into their way of thinking. My impression is that any psychiatrist, psychologist, or psychotherapist worthy of the name has respect for the religious traditions of his or her clients. If they do not have that respect, they should not be doing psychotherapy. And I say this because there are people watching this tape who have been harmed by therapists who did not have a respect for their religious tradition. May I also make the observation that not everybody who's a Catholic has respect for religious life. There used to be a stock phrase around years ago, oh, you've got to go to a good Catholic psychiatrist. No. The fact that a psychiatrist is a Catholic tells you nothing. You don't even know whether he puts money in the basket. What you look for is a psychiatrist, psychologist, or therapist who has a reverence and respect for religious tradition. And they can be Jewish, they can be Protestant, but they have respect. Respect and reverence is more than denominational membership. Obviously, a Catholic who is familiar with religious life, or perhaps a religious who is themselves a psychologist or psychiatrist, can be more understanding. But that doesn't even work all the time. Now, one of the things that got lost in the shuffle of the changes at the end of the Vatican Council was the notion that for a person to be a mature religious, they also had to be psychosexually a mature person. Now, there's a very real problem there, because in a certain sense, a person who has become a religious early in life, like myself, can have only a limited psychosexual development. Because direct sexuality, directly chosen sexuality, is not a part of our lives. It's not there. I might be the greatest golfer in the world, but I'll never know, because I never played golf. You might be the greatest ballerina who ever lived, but you'll never know, because you never pirouetted, you see. And indeed, part of psychosexual development obviously would include the things that lead to marriage and marriage. Now, this means that the vowed person who has observed religious life is going to have to struggle in various ways to achieve a psychosexual maturity without a direct involvement in legitimate sexual behavior, which is part of Christian marriage. And that's a challenge. It's a real challenge. If a person maintains that that cannot be done, then they are maintaining that the whole celibate, chaste religious tradition, not only in the Catholic Church, but in the great religions of the world, is a mistake. They're not only taking on St. Francis and St. Paul and St. Teresa of Avila, they're taking on Gautama Buddha. They're taking on a lot of people. I would rather say that two things result. First of all, a very serious challenge to every religious and priest to be constantly aware of the necessity to grow as a mature person. To be mature, responsible, and caring in as many dimensions of life as possible. Secondly, not to run away from things pertinent to sexuality when they are part of life, not to pretend that they are not there. And thirdly, to grow spiritually. If you're going to be a happy, well-adjusted spiritual person, then spirituality, which is mature, must be a part of your development and growth. Celibates who do not grow spiritually are either dull, repressed, or have great problems with the management of celibacy in their lives. Take it or leave it. Take your choice. There's either mature Christian spirituality or a lot of trouble and a lot of dullness. Now, what do I mean by facing life? All right. The first thing that any religious should do is be able to discuss with appropriate friends, spiritual director, members of the community who are open to intelligent discussion and capable of it. People meet each other at different levels of culture and age in life. But to be able to discuss frankly and openly what sexuality and chastity mean. There's absolutely nothing wrong with discussing sexuality. Unfortunately, some of us grew up in a time where a conversation on sexuality was suspected of being a sin. That's ridiculous. Every religious, every priest, every seminarian should have a spiritual director, some chosen, trusted friends with whom sexuality and its struggles, chastity and its struggles can be discussed. Secondly, this is no moment for the uninformed or the lily-livered. You know people that blush at improper fractions, you know, please, they're no help to the church in this time. This is not 1938, and we're in a lot of trouble. Sexuality is all over the place, so you might as well be hard-boiled. One of the things that the Lord was good to me in, and that He lent me to work with a lot of people who have a lot of sexual problems. And believe me, I've seen many people deeply hurt by sexuality. I've also seen people become very naive about sexuality. In the back of my book, The Courage to be Chaste, I included a fairly large number of suggested readings. I don't agree with every line in every one of those books, but basically they are solid books. If you don't have too much of an opportunity to discuss or absorb things related to sexuality, many of these books, which are the ones I mentioned, are often written for priests and religious, are worthy of your attention. There are a few new ones that aren't in the bibliography, and I'm going to include those new ones. There's even a couple of books that you might have thought that should have been there, and I left them out on purpose, because I don't think that they square very well with the ethical teachings on sexuality of the Catholic Church. Is it possible to be a person who is honest, open about sexuality, struggling to be psychosexually mature, and yet faithfully celibate? I hope it is possible. I hope it is certainly possible for us to grow without necessarily being directly involved in the legitimate exchange of sexual relations which Almighty God has made the foundation of human society and of His church. One of the things that somebody told me years ago is that priests are romantic, and so are sisters, because the very fact that we have a religious vocation makes us often view sexuality without all of the tawdriness that it can develop, all of the sadness that can come into a human life because of sexuality. It's why priests and brothers ran marriage encounter and ministers were not quite so successful. Maybe one of the beautiful things about an intelligent religious chastity is that as bystanders in much of the drama of life, we have an ability from our vocation to appreciate and value sexuality at its very best, even though genital sexuality is not part of our life. As Brother Roger of Taizé has said, religious life should make us not separate, but brothers and sisters of everyone else in the world. Thank you.